This project was funded by the Decentralization Foundation, which you can read about at d24n.org. Sir Tim Roughgarden is a professor of computer science and a member of the Data Science Institute at Columbia University. He's won the Grace Murray Hopper Award and the Gödel Prize. The Decentralization Foundation funded this work by him on EIP 1559. Including this report, Transaction Fee Mechanism Design for the Ethereum Blockchain, an economic analysis of EIP 1559. So I found this report to be excellent. I thought it was educational and readable. Professor Roughgarden, please.
Okay, let me just share my screen. All right, thanks very much, Chris, for the invitation to speak. Very happy to be here. Thanks to everyone in the audience who decided to spend part of their Saturday hearing about EIP 1559, which, as Chris said, is a Ethereum improvement proposal written by Vitalik Buterin, which proposes several tightly coupled changes to the way Ethereum transaction fee mechanism works. And in this talk, I don't want to assume that all of you are necessarily already aficionados of 1559. So I'm going to spend a good chunk of the talk, the talk overall, maybe I'm expecting to be 40 minutes or so. I'll spend a good chunk of it explaining how 1559 works. But what I hope to convey as I describe it is kind of the inevitability of the design, given on the one hand, the goal of easy fee estimation, and on the other hand, the idiosyncratic constraints of permissionless blockchains. So even for those of you that have a pretty good feel for the how of 1559, I'm hopeful that after this talk, you'll have sort of a deeper understanding of the why behind 1559. All right, but before we get into 1559 per se, let's take a step back. Let's ask, like, why does Ethereum even have a transaction fee mechanism at all? Like, why can't we just ignore transaction fees, just say they're zero, just ignore it, ignore the problem? Well, the fundamental issue, it's really the problem you want, which is that a lot of people would like to use the Ethereum network. Okay, so computation in the Ethereum virtual machine, that's a scarce resource. Scarce meaning that the demand for that, for EVM computation, is much, much bigger than the supply. So by supply, what do I mean? Well, as I think most of you know, there's a new block being created on average roughly every 13 seconds. The current maximum size of a block, as measured in gas, which sort of is a proxy for the computational costs, the maximum block size is currently 12.5 million gas. So that'd be ballpark like 600 of the simplest possible transactions. And you're getting one of those every 13 seconds. That's the supply side. On the demand side, well, if you gave EVM computation away for free, way more than 12.5 million gas worth of transactions would be trying to find themselves into each of these blocks. Okay, so that's the sense in which EVM computation is a scarce resource. You cannot give it to everybody who wants it. So who should get it? Well, ideally, you'd like to allocate this scarce resource to the most valuable transactions. Okay, so you'd like to forget about all of the spammy transactions and make sure you have room for all of the transactions that are really providing someone with a lot of value. And so that's the point of prices. And in this context, transaction fees. It allows high value transactions to differentiate themselves by offering to pay relatively high prices. Okay, so by using prices, you filter out all the low value transactions, unwilling to pay the price, leaving only the high value transactions, which is an economically efficient way to use a scarce resource. So that's why we have transaction fees, right? So we'll definitely sometimes talk about the revenue generated by transaction fees, but I want to emphasize that even if you do not care about revenue per se, if you have a scarce resource and you care about allocating it efficiently, you are going to be generating fee revenue as a side effect. Okay, so 1559 is really a pretty major proposal about how these prices are going to get set, okay? About how to change how these prices are going to get set. So let me explain the difference with a real world example. So we're all used to, say, buying stuff on Amazon. You go to a product page, right? There's some posted price. In this case, it's 36 bucks. If you think a book on algorithmic game theory is worth $36 to you, you should buy it. Otherwise, you shouldn't. It's a take it or leave it offer. You just have to make a binary decision. Okay, so very easy. Contrast that with the other extreme, right? One of the most difficult ways to figure out what price you're supposed to be buying. Imagine you're lucky enough to be putting in a bid on a house in a very competitive housing market. as Silicon Valley certainly has been for almost my whole lifetime, right? So there's a house, there's maybe 12 other groups that are all going to be competing for you, have competing bids on that house, and you're trying to figure out what to bid. And that is actually extremely difficult, right? Because you'd like to be kind of the highest bid, but just by a tiny amount. You'd like to just barely beat out all of the competition. But you don't necessarily know what other people are going to bid. You have to make an educated guess about that. And in any case, no matter how smart you are, you might wind up regretting your bid, either because you set it too low and you got outbid by somebody else at a price you would have been willing to pay, or because you set it too high and you get the house, but you could have also gotten it at a much cheaper price. And frankly, maybe the stakes aren't quite as high, but setting transaction fees in Ethereum right now, that is in effect as complex as figuring out how to bid on a house in a competitive market. How are the prices set? Users are responsible for offering them themselves. Okay, so if you create a transaction in Ethereum, you have to specify a parameter known as the gas price, which is your offer of how much Ether you're willing to pay per unit of gas in your transaction. Will you be included in a block? Well, it sort of depends if your proposed gas price is bigger than that of the competing transactions. So just like in the house example, you have to reason about what gas prices other users might be setting. And again, you might wind up regretting your bid no matter how smart you are, either because you overbid or because you underbid. And in a nutshell, the goal of 1559 is to change Ethereum so that transaction fees become as easy as they are on Amazon, so that there is literally just a take it or leave it offer, which says, in effect, right, for the next block, either, if you want to get in this block, fine, but the price is going to be 32 gwei per unit of gas. If that's too high for you, then you should opt out and you should wait until there's a future block with a lower price. And so that's really the goal, is to change the way Ethereum works so that it's as easy as just shopping on Amazon, just figuring out whether you're willing to take a particular take it or leave it offer. All right, so hopefully that sounds like a reasonable goal, right? Yeah, it'd be nice if this was sort of much easier for users. How would you ever accomplish that? That seems like a pretty big change, and it is. So let me now walk you through the sort of components of 1559 and the different ways in which they interconnect. There's several ideas. Maybe the most important is the notion of a base fee, okay? So with each block will be associated a base fee which acts as a reserve price, meaning that to be eligible for inclusion in a block, your offered gas price, like what you're willing to pay, has to be at least the base fee. So the base fee is 20 gwei per gas. Any outstanding transactions not willing to pay 20 gwei per gas are going to be ineligible for inclusion in this block, okay? So that's the base fee. It acts as a reserve price. One extremely important property of the base fee is that it's completely independent of what happens in the current block. It cannot be manipulated by the current miner. It cannot be manipulated by the current users, because it is completely determined by what's already happened in the past, by the blockchain's history, meaning the contents of the predecessors on the longest chain leading up to the block that's currently being mined, okay? So each block is going to have a base fee, acts as a reserve price, depends only on the past history of the blockchain. A couple questions immediately come to mind, okay? So first of all, who gets the base fee revenues, right? Users are going to be paying this base fee, the ones that are willing to pay it. Where does that money go? Question number two is, it's fine to say it depends on blockchain history, but that's kind of vague. Like, how exactly is this base fee going to be set over time? So let's answer those two questions one at a time. First, who gets the base fee revenues? Okay. Your first thought might be, well, this is basically like transaction fees, right? And transaction fees have always sort of gone to the miner of the block, okay? So that seems like the natural place to send the base fee revenues, same place it was going before, to the miner of the block. But here's what's interesting. It actually does not work at all to pass the base fee revenues of a block on to the miner of that block. Okay, so the game theory does not work. The details here, I think are a little bit too into the weeds for us, but intuitively, what goes wrong if you pass base fee revenues onto the miner of the block is that block's miner, along with the users with transactions in that block, can collude off-chain to effectively evade the base fee entirely, okay, just by setting up suitable transfers. So it actually turns out that you think you have a base fee of 20 gwei per unit of gas, But because miners and users can do transfers off chain, it's economically equivalent to having a base fee of 0. So if you were trying to have a base fee, you weren't doing it if you were passing all the revenue onto the miners. Okay, so it has to go somewhere else. Wherever it goes, it cannot go to the miner or the block. Now, maybe this, so if it doesn't go to the block's miner, where does it go? Well, maybe the simplest answer, and the answer which is currently in the 1559 spec, is to simply burn all of the base fee revenues. Okay, and by burn, I just mean you take the coins that users used to pay for the base fee in the block, and then all of those coins are removed permanently from the supply of circulating ethers. Okay, so this is like a stock buyback, and so accordingly, you can sort of think of this as like a lump sum refund to ETH holders, okay, proportional to the current stake. You're taking money out of circulation, which in principle increases the value of all of the coins that remain in circulation. All right, so we'll say more about fee burning, and that's been a lot of the discussion around EIP 1559. But I'm here to sort of opine on the economics, and I do want to, and the game theory, and I want to point out that the game theory does not say you must burn the fees. The game theory says you cannot give the base fee revenues to the miner of the block. Anything else is fine. Just don't give it to the miner of the block. So who else could you give it to? Well, for example, one of the alternative designs discussed in the report would be to pay the base fee revenues forward, okay, to the miners of the blocks that are going to be coming up in the future. If there's time permitting, we'll talk a little bit more about that at the end. All right, so we have this base fee, acts as a reserve price, depends only on the history. We've answered our first question, who gets the revenues? Nobody, okay? We're just removing them from the circulation, so sort of the deflationary pressure. Question number 2, how do you actually set this base fee? Like in what way exactly does it depend on the blockchain history? Okay, so let's first sort of benchmark ourselves, okay? So rather than worry about how are we actually going to wind up computing it, let's just do a thought experiment. Like suppose some base fee fell from the sky magically, okay? What price would we like it to be? What base fee would we like? So the perfect base fee for us is going to be what I'm going to call the market clearing price, okay? By that, I mean sort of the price, so just amount of whey per unit of gas, the price at which demand equals supply, okay? Remember, supply for us, that's one block, 12.5 million gas. By demand equals supply, I mean we'd like a price which is just high enough so that exactly 12.5 million gas worth of transactions are willing to pay it. And it's too high for everybody else. Given such a price falling from the sky, we get everything we want, okay? The block would be fully utilized, and it would be utilized by the highest value transactions, the ones that are willing to pay this base fee. Okay? So that's our benchmark. We would love to somehow approximate the base fee in protocol. So we're going to be adjusting our base fee, basically searching for the market clearing price. Of course, in Ethereum, demand's volatile, both short time scales and long time scales. So the market clearing price is going to be changing. And so we're going to need the base fee to react accordingly. Okay, so it's not a problem we can just solve once. We need to always be searching for the right base fee given the current demand. So how are we going to do that? Well, it's a very natural idea. In economics, it's called tâtonnement, which is French for groping, because you're sort of groping for the market clearing price. And basically, if you observe that demand is like bigger than supply, you're like, oh, I guess the price is too low. I guess the base fee is too low. We should increase it. Whereas if you see some sort of empty blocks, clearly the base fee is too high, so you should decrease it. So that's the simple idea behind tâtonnement. Now, there's sort of an issue in implementing this directly in a blockchain like Ethereum, which is, suppose you see a block which is full, okay, 12.5 million gas in it. How do you know whether you got the base fee just right, and it's actually the market clearing price, or how do you know if instead your base fee is way too low, and there was actually like 10 million more worth of gas that would have liked to have been in this block, but there wasn't room for it? So the problem is that sort of you want to know the transactions that didn't get in, and those are not recorded on chain. Only the included transactions are recorded on chain. So to implement tâtonnement, we need some in-chain proxy for measuring demand. And that brings us to key idea number 2, which is variable size blocks, okay? To this point, and currently, there's just this maximum block size, 12.5 million gas. we're roughly expecting all of the blocks to be, pretty much full, okay, given the demand for Ethereum. We're now going to relax that. 12.5 million gas is not going to be a per block hard constraint. Rather, it's just going to be a constraint on the average gas usage. So we're going to call it a target block size. And we're only going to be responsible for keeping block sizes around 12.5 million on average over time. All right? Blocks are going to be allowed to be bigger than that. We've got to limit how big they could get. So let's cap it at double the normal size. So the new maximum block size is going to be double what it was, 25 million gas. But again, we're shooting for 12.5 million gas per block. And what's very clever about this is this exactly solves our problem of needing an on-chain proxy for whether demand is high or demand is low. Namely, we just look at the sizes of blocks that miners are creating. If we see a block that's too big, bigger than the target, so more than 12.5 million gas in it, we conclude, I guess the demand is, our base fee is too low. The demand is too high. So we need to raise the base fee, so to bring the demand down closer to our target size. Conversely, if we're seeing pretty empty blocks, then we can conclude that the base fee is too high and we need to decrease it, okay? And in the spec, and this is described in the report too, there's a specific formula for exactly how you update the base fee as a function of the previous block sizes. We can talk about this in the Q&A if people are interested, but it's not going to be important for the sort of main 40-minute talk that I'm doing right now. Okay, so there is some way of adjusting. It's a simple function where you adjust upward after big blocks and you adjust downward after small blocks. Okay. Now, I introduced variable size blocks as a solution to how to implement tâtonnement when you don't have explicitly the demand recorded on chain. But actually, variable size blocks have a number of really quite interesting side benefits that are of value in their own right. Really, this is awarding the Ethereum protocol more flexibility in how to manage throughput than it had before. We're basically newly allowing the protocol to borrow capacity, to borrow EVM computation from the near future to bring it forward in time if it's a time of great need. Okay? And so this is particularly helpful when you have a very short, very sharp spike in demand. Okay, where normally, it would just totally, overload the 12.5 million blocks that you're stuck with. But if it's a very short and spiky change in demand, you could have a short sequence of sort of double full blocks, 25 million gas blocks. And then if the demand goes away, then you can make up the balance by having some pretty empty blocks after that. And the best way to appreciate this, frankly, is with a detailed worked example. The report has one. I'm not going to have time to go through it here, but these are a couple graphs from it. So here, the red lines are what happens under 1559, and the blue lines are what happened under the status quo. So in the right figure, you can see that I've fixed the block size at 12.5 million gas. Whereas meanwhile, and so what's happening underneath is this is exactly a short, sudden spike in demand. So it's eight periods, 8 blocks in a row. There's a sudden spike in demand between periods 2 and 7 inclusive. You can see on the right figure that the block size under 1559 quickly adapts, jumps up to 25, stays really high until the demand spike goes away, then actually drops below the target to make up the difference. And you can see in the left figure that while the market clearing price is very spiky under the status quo because you've kept the supply fixed, with the variable blocks that you have under 1559, the transaction fees still go up, but they go up in a much more sort of measured way. Okay. All right, so let me just check if there's anything. Okay, yeah. All right, so I see there's questions coming in. I think I'm going to finish the description of 1559 and then check back in on them. Okay, great. All right, so variable size blocks, they both give us an on-chain proxy for measuring demand, so we know how to adjust the base fee, and then also they have these other benefits as well. All right, so I want to take a one slide aside now for a public service announcement, just because it's not really on the central path to my story here, but it's very important just to say this explicitly. Many people ask, will EIP 1559 bring down transaction fees on Ethereum? People are rightfully wondering about that question. And it sort of depends on what version of the question you mean. So on the previous slide, I showed you a sense or intuition for why in some sense that answer could be yes, right? If you look at this left figure, you see that the spike in the market clearing price when you have the fixed supply, the blue curve, that gets a lot higher than the red curve does. Because the 1559, you're able to exploit these variable size blocks. So if you just cared about sort of like the highest transaction fees that you ever see due to very sudden spikes, we should expect the sort of worst transaction fees you ever see to be better under 1559 because of the mitigating factor of these of this block flexibility. However, if we're not talking about spikes in demand, if we're talking about a sustained period of high demand, okay, a sustained period where demand is much bigger than supply, neither 1559 nor any other transaction fee mechanism is going to save you. The transaction fees will be persistently high if demand is persistently much bigger than supply. So in other words, if really you're worried about persistent high fees, then it's really not a mechanism design problem, it's really a scalability problem. Really what you need to do is either increase the supply or decrease the demand. Those are the two ways that you can get the sort of persistent transaction fees to go down. So there's a couple figures in the report which I've replicated here. The first figure is a case with a very high base market clearing price, about 116. If you double the supply, for example, by doubling the block size, the market clearing price drops all the way down to 33. Similarly, if you half the demand. So you can think of something like sharding as a technique for increasing supply, increasing the amount of transactions that Ethereum can process. You can think of a layer 2 solution like, say, ZK rollups as a version of decreasing demand, because it's replacing what used to be a big bunch of computation which had to happen on chain, moving some of it off chain, and then leaving a smaller amount of on-chain computation to be done. So that in effect is decreasing demand. So something like sharding that increases supply, something like ZK rollups that decreases demand, either of those is going to be successful in lowering market clearing prices. Don't look to a transaction fee mechanism to do that for you. It's really a scalability problem. Okay, great. So now that my conscience is clear, now that I've got that off my back, let me tell you about the third and final key idea in 1559. Okay. So, and this third idea is motivated by two questions. They're different questions, but we're going to have sort of the same solution for both of them. Question one is, we have this base fee and you've told us that you're burning it. And so now like literally nothing is going to the miners other than just like the block reward, the Coinbase transaction. So why would a miner bother to even include a transaction? Why not just mine empty blocks if you're not getting any revenue other than the block reward? So that's a good question. A second question is, when you're particularly concerned about the point where the base fee is much lower than it was supposed to. Okay, so I'm going to call base fees of this form excessively low. So what you want to think about, you just had this persistent period, of low demand. So you have this low base fee because demand is low, and then suddenly the demand shoots way up. Okay, because there's some, who knows, ICO or whatever. Okay, and the base fee will eventually adjust upward and catch up to where it needs to be and be about the market clearing price at the new higher elevated demand. But there will be a transition period where the base fee has not yet caught up to where it needs to be, to the market clearing price. And in that period, in that transition period where the base fee is excessively low, the number of transactions willing to pay the base fee might be way too high, might be even more than the sort of double-sized blocks that we're allowing, more than the 25 million gas. Okay. And in these transition periods, okay, if there's a ton of transactions willing to pay the base fee, a miner has to now decide which transactions to include in the blocks. It can't include them all. Okay, if there's less than 25 million gas transactions willing to pay the base fee, it can just include everybody. But if there's more than 25 million gas, it has to make a choice. Ideally, the miner would like to include the high value transactions, not the low value transactions. How is it going to know which is which? So both of these questions are solved in the same way. This parameter is called various things. I'm going to call them tips. Okay. Basically, what this is a first price auction, okay, as we're familiar with, layered on top of the base fee. Okay. So just like a gas price is today, a tip is going to be specified by the creator of a transaction. Just like transaction fees are today, revenue from the tips are going to be transferred to the miner of the block, okay, the block that includes that transaction. Right. So in effect, as a user, your all-in costs are the base fee, which gets burned, plus the tip, which gets transferred to the miner. All right. Actually, in 1559, there's two bidding parameters. Right? So currently, there's only one bidding parameter, which is the gas price. In 1559, there are two. There's the tip, and then there's also, you don't know what the base fee. The base fee might get really high, so we need to allow users to put a cap. Okay, so there's going to be a fee cap, and then it's guaranteed you'll never have to pay more than that. Okay, so if the base fee goes above your fee cap, you're just going to be sort of out of contention until the base fee comes back down. All right. So users in 1559 specify these two things: a tip and a fee cap. And what you wind up paying, your gas price in effect, is either the base fee plus the tip, or if that's bigger than your fee cap, it would just be your fee cap. Now, in my experience, many people, when they see this part of the design, they're kind of like, okay, why did you bother with all this other stuff? Like key ideas 1 and 2. Ultimately, you just have a first price auction at the end of the day. So like, in what way could it possibly be better than the status quo? Okay. I think that's an understandable reaction. Let me, on this slide, just sort of explain kind of the hope, the hope of why this might be better. And these hopes are backed up in the mathematical analysis in the report. But here's the intuition for why this is not going to be, just all the same problems as a first price auction. So again, there's really two regimes, okay? So there's this exceptional regime of a transition period where you're exiting a sustained period of low demand and suddenly experiencing a big demand spike, okay? So that's going to be a problematic case, okay? So the hope is that's a very low percentage of the time. Maybe 1% of the blocks, hopefully, are in these kinds of transition periods. Remember, a steady high demand is fine, okay? There we're not worried about. We're worried about when the appropriate base fee suddenly goes from a low number to a big number, and it just takes a little while to get between the two different points. All right, but so hopefully it's 1% of the time that you're in these weird transition periods with these sudden spikes. The other 99% of the time, when the base fee is not excessively low, what does that mean? That time, the amount of transactions willing to pay the current base fee is less than 25 million gas. Okay? That means the base fee is like some kind of reasonable approximation about where it's supposed to be, some kind of approximation of the market clearing price. Right? Remember, we're shooting for 12.5 million demand. So we're saying as long as you haven't had so low, as long as it's 25 million or less, well then there's actually room for all of the transactions willing to pay the base fee. Right? So the miner can go up to 25 million gas if it wants. So it can include everybody willing to pay the base fee. That means from a user perspective, you're not actually competing with anybody, right? This would be like you're competing with sort of 9 other people for a total of 10 houses that are all identical, right? There's no problem. You can all get what you want. You can all get your house. And if there's no need to compete, well, then you don't actually have to engage in the first price auction, right? So just pay the base fee. All right, or maybe like you leave a small tip for the miner just so that it's worth their while to include their transaction in your block. By small, I'm thinking something like 1 to 2 GWei per unit of gas. The way I like to think, you probably can't get away with 0. Miners probably wouldn't include it if it was super small. The way I think about this is like, if you left a penny on a sidewalk in a busy city, it might be a while before sort of someone walks by and picked it up. If you left a dollar bill, even though that's not a lot of money, you wouldn't have to wait that long. Okay, maybe Silicon Valley is different, I don't know. But most places, if you leave a dollar on the sidewalk, someone will pick it up pretty quickly. So that's what this small tip is, the 1 to 2 GWei. That's just the dollar so that the miner's motivated to pick it up off of the sidewalk. Now there is this 1% of the time where the base fee is excessively low, and hey, you don't get easy fee estimation, but you're no worse than the status quo. You just revert back pretty gracefully to a first price auction as we now know them. Okay, so that's the intuition behind the tips, and that concludes the review I wanted to do of 1559 before I say a little bit about the game theoretic findings in my report. So let me check in. Can I ask any of the panelists, are there any questions which you feel like are particularly urgent to address? By the way, I left up on the screen, this slide is just a review of what we've done. Okay, so sort of the 5 main ideas of 1559. So this is just to sort of take stock, consolidate, make sure we're totally solid on the proposal. Yes, so Alex Stokes, what you said is exactly right. To be clear, in the regime with small tips, users won't be competing, so you don't have to differentiate your transaction with a competitive tip. That's exactly correct. So Lefteris asks, could it be that there will be some transactions that get delayed? I assume, because you're concerned about the base fee sort of not dropping quickly enough. And so the answer is yes. I mean, so if you look, it's hard to, I mean, the delay, some users will experience bigger delays, some will experience smaller delays. So the users that experience smaller delays, they'll be like the ones that get sort of stuffed into a double full block during a heavy demand spike. But then again, any 25 million gas block has to be compensated later by a block that's less than 12.5 million. And so you know, if you sort of show up and don't have that high a fee cap, then there'll be this period where you do have to wait for the base fee to drop. So the delays, you know, some users will be better off, some will be worse off, depending on the exact timing of how you interact with spikes in demand, and also, of course, depending on your fee cap and tip. There's a question, can't the miners use any excess supply with undervalued transactions instead of waiting for the base fee to drop? I mean, I guess I may be misunderstanding the question, but I don't see how that's distinct from a first price auction. I mean, really the whole point of the base fee is to prevent transactions who are not willing to pay the base fee from being in the block. Why would you want to prevent transactions from being in the base fee? Because you want to sort of control, again, you're searching for the market clearing price. You basically, what you wish is that you wish that every single period, for every single block, magically from the sky, the market clearing price would be dropped down. And you would just you would just post that price, and then you'd have every block exactly 12.5 million gas full, and it would be with exactly the highest value transactions at that period. So I'm going to, you know, the parts of the report get pretty technical. And I think it would be inappropriate to get super technical here. So I'm going to cover this with a light touch. But obviously this is all stuff I can talk about until the cows come home. So if you want to get into the weeds in the Q&A, I'm certainly happy to do that about the actual math. Okay. So game theoretic findings. So let me start with a couple slides these two slides we're going to have really, you know, formal mathematical guarantees. Right? There'll be theorems, there's proofs, they're all in the report if you're interested. So the next couple of slides we're going to think about the time scale of a single block. Okay, so we're just going to think about, you know, one miner, incentives that one miner faces right now. Same thing for the users, the incentives those users face right now. So the main thing we're not worrying about on this slide and the next, but we'll talk a little bit in a couple slides. What we're ignoring right now is the possibility of, say, a miner who's willing to make significant short-term sacrifices in the hopes that there'll be some payoff in the future. Okay. Again, that's an important issue, and we'll talk about it, but I'm not talking about it for the next 3 guarantees. Because as we'll see, there are lots of auction formats that have serious problems, even already at the time scale of a single block. Okay? Even getting good guarantees here is already non-trivial. Okay. All right. So I'm going to show you 3 guarantees. Again, there's formal theorem statements in the report. And for each of the 3 guarantees, I'll point out some kind of more obvious auction formats which fail to have these guarantees. Okay, so 1559 will satisfy all 3 of them. Okay, and none of the other obvious formats, all of the other obvious formats will fail to satisfy at least one of the 3. So this will be one way to make a case for 1559 being game theoretically, if not optimal, then at least kind of better than sort of the simpler ideas that you would try first. Okay. All right, so guarantee number 1 is that you don't expect any shenanigans by miners. Okay, so what are you expecting miners to do? Well, miners get the tips, they don't get the base fee, so you're basically just expecting them to pack their block as full as possible to get as much tips as possible. Okay, if the base fee is sort of reasonably correct, they may as well just pack all of the eligible transactions and pick all of their tips. If the base fee is excessively low and they don't have room for all of the eligible transactions, you'd expect them to pick the ones with the highest tips. And indeed, there's no reason for miners not to do that. Okay, so for example, there's no reason for them to try to manipulate the auction by injecting fake transactions. In fact, fake transactions are a really bad idea when you have a fee burn, because you basically get no upside and all downside. Now, lest this first guarantee seem like trivial, like what kind of transaction fee mechanism would not at least have this property that miners kind of behave in an obvious way? Well, this is actually failed by an extremely famous auction format. So if you sort of looked up in auction theory book, chapter 1, what it would tell you to do to solve the problem we're currently solving, it would tell you to run what's called a second price or Vickrey auction. And those are beautiful auctions. However, the properties of those auctions require a trusted third party to implement the mechanism, which of course is exactly what we do not have in a permissionless blockchain. Okay? It's up to the miners to execute the mechanism. And so a second price auction is very easy to manipulate using fake transactions. So it's a total non-starter in a blockchain context. Okay? So as a sanity check, so this is the reason you never hear about second price auctions in blockchains. You only hear about first price auctions. And this is probably the #1 reason. All right, but 1559 is fine. Okay, so no issues with fake transactions for 1559. All right, second guarantee is a quite interesting one, which is, so you might recall we had this little detour where we said, where do the base fee revenues go? And we said, let's try giving them to the miner of the block. And then we said, oh, that doesn't work. Why didn't it work? Because the miner of that block and the users in that block have an incentive to collude off-chain to evade the base fee. Okay, and notice, I mean, that's again something that happens at the time scale of a single block. Okay, so it's just for this block, they make this off-chain agreement to basically get out of the base fee. Okay, so that's an example where there is an incentive for miners and users to collude off-chain. Actually, there's a second really interesting example. I don't have time to do this in detail, but it is detailed in the report, or we can talk about it in the Q&A, which is perhaps some of you out there, the reason you like 1559 is the fee burn, right? Maybe you don't really care that it's sort of kind of annoying to set, gas prices right now. Maybe that's not something you care a lot about, but you really like the deflationary pressure coming from the fee burn. And you might be wondering, well, geez, I mean, like, what's really important here is the fee burn. Why don't we just sort of do the minimal design that includes the fee burn? Like, forget about all this base fee stuff. Like, let's just run first price auctions like normal, and then say burn half of the fees in a first price auction. Okay. This totally doesn't work. And again, the reason it totally doesn't work is because of off-chain collusion between a miner and users. As soon as you start sort of burning stuff, as soon as you give miners and users control over how much is burned in a block, they're going to move everything off chain to keep the burn at 0. And so the magic of the history dependent base fee is that miners and users of the current block cannot do anything about the on-chain burn. It is out of their control. And that is the reason, and again, you can prove this formally, there is no incentive for miners and users to collude off-chain. They can never be better off by doing this, unlike these two other designs, giving the base fee revenue to the miner or burning fees in a first price auction. And there's sort of a really interesting corollary of this, that sort of the threats of off-chain agreements do, which is probably, there's a bunch of benefits you hear people talking about with 1559, but probably the most frequent two are easy fee estimation, like the base fee, and fee burning. Those are probably the two you hear the most about. And what this says is they're actually very inextricably linked. Okay, so these are not independent changes you could make. If you try to have the base fee, but you don't have the fee burning, it doesn't work, as we've seen. If you try to have the fee burn, but you don't have the base fee, it also doesn't work. Okay, so you either need to do neither of them, or you need to do both. Okay, you don't quite need to do a fee burn, you just need to make sure it doesn't go to the miner of the block, but you need to do something like a fee burn if you want to have good user experience and vice versa. Okay. So that's kind of neat. So if you're wondering, like, why does 1559 make so many changes all at the same time, this starts suggesting what some of those reasons are. Really, you kind of need them at the same time. All right, so those are the first two guarantees. But you might remember, I said at the beginning, right, the raison d'etre of 1559 is really supposed to be easy fee estimation. It's supposed to make it like shopping on Amazon. So where's the guarantee that says it's like shopping on Amazon? Well, here it is. Okay. So this guarantee is going to be, there's going to be a couple caveats. They're caveats that are pretty minor, but they're worth noting. First, as we said, when you're in this transition period and the base fee hasn't caught up to some spike in demand, you really are reverting back to a first price auction. Okay, so you really are no better than a first price auction in terms of the user experience. It's really kind of the same thing. So we're really wondering, okay, well, at least outside of these periods of sort of rapid transition, is there sort of an easy fee estimation? And basically the answer is yes. You need one assumption that no users are doing anything crazy. And here by crazy, I mean something very specific. I mean setting the fee cap to be strictly larger than the maximum willingness to pay. There's no reason you should ever do this. This is a bad idea, but in principle, users could do this. If you're willing to assume that no users kind of overshoot their max willingness to pay for no reason, then we're good. Okay? Or 1559 is good, in the sense that users of 1559 have an obvious bid, an obvious way to set their bidding parameters, which is optimal. Okay? Optimal in the sense that it maximizes the utility of that user. Okay? In other words, this is how we say that a user does not have to reason about what anyone else is doing. Okay, there's just this obvious strategy it should pick. And that's what we mean by easy fee estimation. That's what we mean by good UX. Okay? So what's the obvious bid? The obvious bid is you set your fee cap equal to the maximum willingness to pay, as you'd expect, right? That's the whole point of the fee cap, is it caps how much you're ever going to get charged. And then you should set the tip to be the minimum amount necessary to incentivize the miner to include a transaction. So this is like the dollar on the sidewalk that I mentioned. And the intuition here is what we said before. Okay, so as long as the base fee is not excessively low, there's room for everybody. Fundamentally, eligible users are not competing with each other, so you can just get away with a minimal tip. Okay, so this is the formal version of that intuition. Outside of these transition periods, and under a weak behavioral assumption, indeed, fee estimation is easy. It's literally just going to be the base fee plus this minimal tip. All right, so good. Oh, and again, first price auctions do not satisfy this guarantee, right? There's basically never any conditions where it's obvious what to do in a first price auction. Okay, so 1559 has all three of these, and we've now enumerated several kind of simpler mechanisms which fail at least one of them. All right, so that's a pretty strong argument. Okay, that 1559 does what it sets out to do. Let me just, I want to wrap up shortly. So let me just flash these slides quickly, just so people are prompted to ask about them in Q&A if they want. So these next two slides reference actually quite long sections in the report. So again, happy to talk about this at length afterwards. So those guarantees are on a single time scale. Definitely there's a reasonable worry about, will a miner or maybe a cartel of miners with a non-trivial fraction of the overall hash rate, will they somehow collude in a sustained way to manipulate the protocol over longer timescales? And in a way, it's a little tricky to say, because if you look around now, it seems miners do coordinate for certain purposes. Like, it seems that whenever the maximum block size gets changed, that seems to be an explicit coordination amongst the miners, or at least the biggest miners. On the other hand, there's stuff miners could do if they coordinated that they don't. Okay, an extreme example would be a 51% attack, but there's also lots of other things they could do that they appear not to. So the question on people's minds is like, okay, miners don't seem to coordinate now, at least not in a way that's harmful. Is that going to change in a post-1559 world? Okay, and basically the good news is that the difficulty, okay, so if you make a list of all of the reasons why it's hard or not in their interest for miners to collude in the status quo first price auctions, all of those impediments remain equally valid in a post-1559 world. Okay, so sort of the difficulty of sustaining collusion for nefarious purposes, that does not get any easier for miners to pull off post-1559 than it is now. The sort of caveat is that, on the other hand, don't forget, we are burning this base fee. And my impression is that, many miners sort of see this as, which is understandable, sort of see it as an attack on their revenue stream. So it could be that even though the difficulty of colluding remains the same, it could be the motivation among miners to pull it off goes up. Okay, so I don't make any formal predictions about this point in the report. I just point out that, if you look at the game theory and what makes colluding hard, all of that remains the same post 1559. But I do think the Ethereum community would do well to discuss at some length, maybe how to increase the amount of buy-in compared to what I've seen anecdotally so far. The last thing is just there's some alternative designs, right? So you want to ask, okay, so 1559 has some nice properties, but you want to ask, is there a different mechanism which is better? Okay, it achieves either the same goals in a sort of easier, simpler way, or sort of has even better guarantees. And so there's three things I just want to sort of flash very briefly. One we already mentioned. The game theory only requires base fee revenues to be withheld from a block's miner. It's not important that it's burned. So an alternative design would be to, for example, pay it forward to miners of future blocks. Another interesting design I call the tipless mechanism in the report is rather than letting users sort of specify these variable tips, you could have a hard-coded tip, okay, sort of as a parameter of the protocol. Again, still being transferred to the miner as an incentive for the miner to include transactions. This variation has the benefit that it's actually even easier for users than 1559. You have to make even less assumptions. It's even more obvious what you should do. The bad news, and one could debate how big a deal this is, but the bad news is in these transition periods where you have a low base fee, you would expect sort of tip markets to emerge off-chain because users can no longer express those preferences on-chain. And then the final thing, I mentioned there was this base fee update rule. It wasn't important what the formula was. The formula is in the report, or in the spec. I think it's a totally reasonable starting point for an update rule, but I think anyone who looks at it has the feeling that it feels a little arbitrary, and I share that feeling. And I think this is a very natural thing to iterate on as we see more and more deployments of 1559. All right, so pretty much used up my time, so let me just leave you with a slide, which is just the conclusions section of the reports. But in a nutshell, 1559, in my estimation, really does succeed in its original raison d'etre of improving the user experience of better fee estimation. Under most of the time and under reasonable assumptions, users should have obvious optimal bids, which is exactly what they do not have in first price auctions now. There are, of course, risks. Those are detailed here in the second paragraph. And I'm really looking forward to seeing the community's discussion of 1559 and whether the benefits are worth the risks in the months to come. So let me stop there and we can switch to the Q&A. Thanks.
Wonderful. Thank you very much. What we had hoped was to see if Vitalik had any comments or questions for Tim. Vitalik, it looks like you've joined. Do you have any comments or questions?
Are you guys hearing me okay?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay. So I wanted to actually start off with a bit of a broader question for Tim. Just going through this experience, and of what are your, so you've now spent months deeply looking at least one economics problem in the blockchain space, and you've spent many years looking at mechanism design things in the broader world. And like, what struck you as being kind of interesting or different? Like, what properties does the blockchain space have that you haven't seen before in other contexts, and what things are similar?
Right, that's a great question. I mean, a few things. One actually came up in the talk, when I sort of was discussing why we can't use victory auctions. So, a big difference between permissionless blockchains and traditional auction theory is, trust assumptions. So most traditional economic mechanism design has trust assumptions on the person implementing the mechanism, which, for their applications is usually quite appropriate, but I mean, it's not appropriate here. There is a sort of new branch of mechanism design that's just sort of been developed in the last few years called credible mechanism design. And that is also trying to address this same issue. So how do you have mechanisms which, have good properties, not just for the participants, that they should do that they're incentivized to do what they should do, but also for the auctioneer or the person running the mechanism. And there's actually some really nice theory being done there. There's a paper cited in the report for those of you that are interested. Credible mechanism design.
Was that the one from Sheng Wu?
Exactly. Yeah. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And I'd say another thing which has been fascinating. I mean, it's and this is maybe more of a difference like theory versus practice than sort of, econ versus blockchain. But, it's one thing to sort of write out equations in your armchair and, prove theorems and, opine on what you think would work, right? And then it's quite a different thing, first of all, to build stuff. And obviously, this community has been amazing, since the beginning. Like, stuff just gets built. It's not talk; it's really kind of action, or at least, the best of the community certainly is a lot of action. So people also talk a lot about consensus in blockchains, right? And sometimes that means like the technical, like layer one, like which kind of consensus protocol you're running, Nakamoto or BFT or whatever. But I mean, I'm just, it's been fun watching, the cat herding that happens among the Ethereum community, which I assume is sort of standard for kind of big open source projects, but just, this need to, like, it's not only that you have to build stuff, it's also that you kind of have to have to socialize it and get buy-in. And so for example, so specifically in this project, right, I mean, I feel like I became more familiar with the competing concerns of the different stakeholders in Ethereum, right? I mean, so you have people who, you know, really what they care about is sort of innovation, and they want sort of adoption to grow, you know, and so easy fee estimation, you know, I think it's in that spirit. You know, you see people where they're thinking of Ethereum primarily as an investment vehicle. You know, and I think some of the people who are, you know, the biggest fans of the fee burning aspects come from that side, right? And then you have miners who, you know, sort of have a business sort of running, you know, collecting block rewards and transaction fees and so on, and they kind of see this as an assault on their livelihood. And you know, ultimately, you know, there will be some hard fork, and you know, we'll just have to see kind of what happens. But so just watching the tension, I'd say, between the different stakeholders has been extremely interesting, and it's going to be fun watching how it plays out, I would say, in the months to come.
Definitely. It's you know, bringing things from theory to practice, and is doing so quite quickly is definitely one of the most exciting things about the space for myself too. I mean, even Ethereum itself, just a little over 5 years ago, was just really interesting to see, you know, computer programs on a blockchain go from just something that we talk about in blog posts to, like, you know, here you go, somebody wrote one, and here's a link to the thing on the block explorer, and it's on chain. In practice, was just quite exciting, and just opened so much space for people to do even more experiments on top of that. And I think this is the first time we're doing a kind of significant economics upgrade, as opposed to you know, like virtual machine upgrade or cryptography upgrade to the Ethereum blockchain. So it's a slightly different kind of thing. It's slightly different to ways of determining you know, what exactly it means for something to be verified as being secure, for example. But it's definitely an interesting journey nonetheless. So another kind of a broad question again. Do you have any ideas of like what other kind of economic features of Ethereum, or things on Ethereum blockchains in general, do you think would be kind of interesting to be for us as a community to analyze more in the future?
Yeah, great question. So, you know, I think probably it's probably worth making a distinction between more micro questions and more macro questions. And frankly, my macro knowledge is pretty much non-existent. But, you know, so in there, I would include things like, right, so something that comes up in 1559, I didn't have time to talk about this, but like if you think about the two versions where the fees are burned, or where the fees are paid forward to miners, that's almost a sort of, you know, it seems like I mean, that's fundamentally an economic decision, you know, both in sort of how the pie gets distributed, but also just in terms of monetary policy, really. Because if you pay all those fees forward, you're basically, at least in the short term, committing to an inflation rate of 4%, say, and it's pretty much fixed, because again, you're issuing the block reward and you're not burning the fees. If you are burning the fees, you're going to have an inflation rate that's less than 4%. And you don't really know how much less than 4% it's going to be. It's going to depend on the demand for sort of EVM computation during that particular time. So maybe it'll be 3%. Hey, maybe it'll even be minus 1%. Maybe even the burned base fee revenue sort of is bigger than the block reward. It's hard to say. So from a macro perspective, I mean, so I'm sort of curious if one could tell a story about why one of these is better than the other along some dimension, right? So like, is there any reason one should be worried about sort of an inflation rate that fluctuates erratically between, you know, minus 4% and 4%? Is that a problem in any sense? Or is it good for some reason? So that's kind of on the macro side, and which is not my expertise. So the micro side, which includes mechanism design, I mean, there I think, I mean, looking ahead, you know, just thinking kind of like clean slate. So not so much kind of what would be easy to start on right now, but just kind of thinking more like 5 to 10 years ahead. I mean, you could definitely imagine trying to price things in a more fine-grained way. Speaking now about transaction fees again. So, so currently, basically, everything's boiled down to gas, right? So there's different types of costs that a contract is going to suffer. All of that gets sort of boiled down to a common access, gas, which makes a lot of sense. It makes a lot of sense to have one parameter until maybe if it starts breaking or something. So I guess I would say, like, what if you wanted to have more fine-grained pricing of resource usage on Ethereum? So that could include, like maybe transactions have, more than one attribute, it's not just gas, but you sort of break apart, storage versus computation versus et cetera. And the prices for those could even sort of evolve independently. And, I've seen some discussions of, state rents, for example, which I think are interesting. So that's the main direction I would say, right? So it's fine, like everything's been boiled down to as if there is only one type of good and it's a fungible good. All units of gas are the same, they're all priced the same. That I think is a very natural direction to start looking at slightly more complex designs.
Yeah, no, I think I would definitely agree with that too. Like even in my original blockchain resource pricing paper, one of the biggest point I made, other than the EIP 1559 exposition, was basically this: that if you want to break if you were only able to make one distinction between different types of blockchain resources, probably, but I think by far the most meaningful one to make is between storage use than everything else. And the reason is that storage use has this really important difference, which is that everything except for storage mostly affects just the nodes that are online at that particular time, whereas increasing the storage size affects nodes available at that particular time and potentially everyone else going into the future forever. And so, like, obviously you want to remedy that by just charging much more for storage than for other things, which we do. But also there's like that heterogeneity that has some kind of other consequences. Like, for example, if fees are 10 times higher on Tuesday because there's a lot more demand on Tuesday, well, that doesn't actually mean that you should charge 10 times more for increasing the storage size on Tuesday, because most of those consequences are going to be felt like months or years into the future anyway. So definitely a lot of very interesting things to be looking into there more, and there's a lot of kind of storage related things happening in the ecosystem on a technical level as well. Like you might hear about the phrase stateless clients at some point eventually, and so forth. Right. Okay. So those are some macro questions. Some kind of micro things. So like we've talked a lot about kind of collusion, like big collusion attacks, right? Of the kind of 50% or more than 50% level. But there's also the possibility of like smaller collusion attacks, right? So things where you might have a mining pool that has, say, like 10% of the hash power that tries to do things to try to extract more tips, for example, right? And mining pools with 10%, they have much less power than 50% because they can't censor transactions. But what they can do is they can impose a 10% risk on any transaction that transaction will have to wait a single slot. And there's definitely high priority users for whom that's a fairly significant inconvenience. So have you tried looking at all on kind of micro attacks that are being done by medium-sized actors, or potentially any way things like that could be mitigated?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, I've thought about it, some sort of prompted by interest in the community as sort of the work was developing. I don't have a formal model for it. I mean, I should say in general, and those of you who look at the report will sort of notice this, that the work that's on the sort of single block time scale, that's all kind of very rigorous. So that, I mean, that's really something I could kind of, write a economic theory paper around. Whereas the discussion of collusion is much more qualitative, I would say. So I mean, it's weaker in a sense because you don't have like a formal model with sort of formal theorem statements. It's much more descriptive. Like here's what we observe, and then speculation about what 1559 would change. There's a little bit of commentary in there. The point that you raised about. So one thing that I don't have very good intuition about, and so one thing that's going to be tricky about doing a model there, or a general model there, is it's really. I mean, sort of it's going to depend a lot on the response of users to, like you said, a risk. So suppose there's a 1 in 10 chance you have to wait 1 extra block, 13 extra seconds. I don't have a good sense of sort of how many people that is, right? So obviously there's some cost benefit analysis, right? So you can do that. You can say, I'm going to reject all of these, right? So the 10% pool would be leaving money on the table in the short term. Right, so there are these sort of lower fee transactions it could include if it wanted, and it's excluding just to kind of put upward price pressure in the future. And so ultimately, it's some kind of cost-benefit analysis that mining pool has to do. It's like, oh well, we're giving up 0.05 ETH of transaction fees, by excluding these people and implementing reserve price, but we expect when we next mine a block 10 time steps from now, we kind of expect to see, they're wondering if they're going to see enough of a boost in revenue from higher bids in the next block they mine 10 blocks from now. And so, that's what the cost benefit analysis comes down to. So obviously it's going to be very sensitive to whatever model you use of, how transaction creators, or wallets or whatever are responding to these sort of small risks. And that's not something I feel comfortable just writing down from the armchair. I could imagine looking at the data we see in Ethereum to ground a sort of model, but definitely the conclusions of the analysis are going to depend on that model, which then always means you better be careful about exactly which assumptions you make. Whereas, what's nice about the single block timescale analysis is you don't need to make any assumptions about, there's assumptions, of course, but people can have whatever values they have, whatever, it sort of doesn't matter. Whereas this really depends on these sort of more nuanced properties of how demand responds to kind of, right, so even in the report, I don't really talk about delay much. You can talk about waiting costs, you could include that in the model, right? But so with this proposal, it would even be like kind of it would be a probabilistic delay. So you'd have to say, I guess you could work with expectations, and just have a waiting cost and then say, okay, so suppose the expected wait time would be 1.1 instead of 1. I guess you could have a model around that. Short version is, in the report says a little bit about that. In my opinion, it's fairly weak on this point, sort of medium-sized cartels. I think it's a great opportunity for some future research with the one, the one caveat that my guess is the results will be fairly sensitive to the details of the modeling.
So one of my own kind of perspectives on economics that I guess I've acquired over the years is just like, I think if we want to talk about just the limits of kind of economic analysis to be able to kind of describe the real world, like there's a lot of categories that people like to bring up. There's like imperfect information, irrationality, and this long list of things where, irrationality in particular is kind of hard to create mathematical models for. But the other kind of big one that's really important, I think, is collusion, right? Like basically just the fact that, collusion is just like one word with a negative connotation that can describe it, but it's a fairly universal thing, right? Where, like, for example, if you have some big second price auction, then it's efficient if everyone only cares about themselves, but then the economics of it start getting really weird if you assume that the top 2 bidders are either colluding with each other, or sometimes they might be kind of partially colluding with each other. Like, what if there are 2 companies that have some shareholders in common but not others? In the case of mining pools, or miners, a lot of the miners know each other. They kind of go to the same parties, live in the same communities. In practice, spends time in the same WeChat groups, and a lot of them are based in China and so forth. And in the case of proof of stake, you have kind of ETH holders, and they kind of have connections with each other too. And sometimes they're, and especially if you start thinking about these larger pools, and so you do get this really complicated world where none of the actors are really looking out for, even if they were rational, they would not be looking out for just their own interests. They would be looking out for some kind of complicated combination of their own interests and the interests of some actors that happen to be close to them, and they might have they might be kind of playing long-term games with each other that would encourage them to cooperate with each other, and they might not have kind of open long-term games with other actors and so forth. And once your model of the world starts incorporating these things, it definitely becomes much harder to kind of create anything that works perfectly, and even get kind of any ironclad predictions about the outputs of a particular mechanism, right? And in the blockchain space, this is one of those. It's, as you've said, an even bigger challenge, because you just know less about who the participants are, and you can't necessarily stop the participants from eventually forming into these kind of congregations and having some kind of connection to each other, whether it's between miners and miners, or miners and stakers, or even kind of miners and the transaction senders. So I think this is one of the kind of broader things, and a lot of people, but including the blockchain space as well, to kind of struggle with, which is just how to design mechanisms to be more robust in that kind of world.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off.
No, I think I finished the thought.
Okay.
I don't know. Is that something that you've had thoughts on at all?
I've certainly had conversations about. I mean, you're absolutely right. I mean, it really. So, cryptography. I mean, even before blockchain, I first started doing mechanism design work maybe 2004 or something like that, and I was in a computer science department. So, anytime I'd talk to a cryptographer, they would ask me about this because collusion was so much on their mind. If I was talking to a distributed computing person, they probably would have asked as well, because those are, ongoing concerns. And it's funny, like really in economics, in mechanism design specifically. Okay, so basically, here's what happens. So you can write down nice mathematical definitions of various senses in which you can be collusion resistant. There's different versions of it, but there's versions of where forming a cartel doesn't help people. So those are definitions that are not hard to write down. Then you start asking questions like, are there any mechanisms which satisfy any of these definitions? And there are a few nice cases where the answer is yes, but most commonly, the theory work tends to come up with impossibility results, which basically say like only sort of trivial and uninteresting mechanisms satisfy the collusion proofness properties. In other words, when you try to address collusion within the mechanism, it kind of ties your hands much too tightly. There's basically nothing you can do. And so for that reason, people who work in the trenches of mechanism design sort of outside of the blockchain world, so like spectrum auctions or matching theory or what have you, basically they have available to them more or less a legal channel. So they market designers, in my experience, tend to sort of factor, right? There's certain problems you can sort of handle within the mechanism and center problems within the mechanism. And there's other ones where you need this separate hammer, right? Where basically you make it, you write the contract of participation to make certain things illegal, and then you have some method of detecting it at least some of the time and then enforcing it. And so there's sort of a, again, there are exceptions. There are some cases where you get some nice collusion resistant properties, but often there's a little bit of a, I don't want to call it a cop out. I mean, from a math
Mhm.
perspective, it feels like a cop out. On the other hand, like in their applications, they literally do have these
I like the pun.
big channels. Yeah.
Cop out.
Yeah. On the other hand, in their defense, right, like if you're running a big spectrum auction, you can make it illegal. Now, maybe people collude undetectably. It's hard to know, but you can make it hard for people to do it undetectably. One story I love talking about that is, so in the early spectrum auctions, when they first started doing them, like in the mid 90s, bidders had figured out this way how to collude within the mechanism itself. So basically, they're all bidding on sort of spectrum licenses in different geographic areas in the United States. And, as usual, like revenue is going to come from competition, right? So you want sort of different companies to be competing with each other. Companies would like to not compete each other and just sort of carve up the map for themselves and pay sort of the minimal reserve price on each. And so they started using the lower order bits of their bids to carve out, to say which license numbers that they wanted, right? So it would be like $170,000 and 23, and that would indicate that 23 was the license that they really wanted, and anyone else should sort of make note of that and then go for something else. And so that was an example where you can at least make this collusion harder to do by making, forcing bid increments to be multiples of $10,000 or something like that. But so that's sort of an example how, some types of collusion, maybe you can't prevent it, but hopefully you can at least discourage it and make it harder within the mechanism. But, for those kinds of auctions, they literally can, they can take people to task if they're known to be colluding. So blockchain is, permissionless blockchains is a really kind of unique challenge. One positive, actually, going back to 1559, because in addition to collusion among miners, you can worry about collusion among users. You mentioned, like in a second price auction, you already have issues there. In a first price auction, you'd also have issues with collusion among sort of the top bidders. They could push the price down. But when you have a posted price mechanism, the way 1559 is, outside of these sort of sudden transition periods, right? So remember the obvious bid is you just, you basically bid the base fee plus the small tip. So it's basically acting as like a posted price mechanism with that as the price. So it's like you go to an Amazon page and you see listed, base fee plus, $1. And then you decide whether you want it or not. Those posted price mechanisms, they actually have excellent collusion resistant properties against users, right? So if a bunch of users get together, they can't influence each other's prices, right? All of them are paying the same amount. Just like on Amazon, if a bunch of you want to go buy something on Amazon, like you don't affect each other's prices, it's just kind of all the same. So that's an example of actually like a rare bright spot where you can actually have a formal collusion resistant guarantee. Again, here we're talking just about users colluding with each other at the time scale of a single block, so it's pretty limited. But again, something like a second price auction or first price auction wouldn't actually have that property. The other thing I'd say is moving forward, one thing I really wonder about, I said how, in classical economic mechanism design, they sometimes assume things that they have and we don't, like a legal channel. But they also assume they don't have things that we do have, namely cryptography specifically. And one research direction which I think should be investigated much more heavily is in what cases and in what senses can economic impossibility results be overcome with using cryptography, techniques from cryptography. And actually, there's a nice example. We talked about credible mechanism design very briefly. And so there's a classical econ paper where they don't assume cryptography. And they kind of prove that, like you're basically stuck. If you have to use a static mechanism, you're stuck with the first price auction. If you want to sort of have an iterative version, then you're sort of stuck with an English auction. And there's a recent paper out of Princeton which shows that actually if you have cryptography, you have possibility results that go beyond their uniqueness results. And that was just from maybe 6 months ago. So I hope that's the beginning of a new direction where it's like, yes, there's certain things that we're missing from classical economics, but then we also have tools in our toolbox that they never think about.
Yeah, no, they like the blockchain space is like one of the places where where a lot of that cryptography is starting to be developed pretty quickly. So
Yep.
I know,
So guys, maybe so I think this is wonderful and fascinating. Maybe we'll come back to hear more. I wanted to give a few other people just at least a chance to participate. Steve, did you have any question or comment?
Um, I have a little bit of a question. It kind of riffs a little bit off something that Vitalik said. Um, Vitalik was asking the question about sort of high stakes transactions. What happens if a miner can impose a cost of a 10% chance of a block delay? Um, and I think in Ethereum, uh, Tim, you commented a little bit about you could start to think about modeling a waiting time and the cost of that. Part of what makes that really tricky in an Ethereum context is that oftentimes we have things that are literal races, where somebody's trying to exploit an arbitrage, and so the value of getting something done in block T is very large, and in T+1 it's very low. And so aside from the minor collusion issue and the interesting questions of the existence of those things maybe making some kinds of games on the part of miners profitable, it gets to a question I generally had with respect to the analysis of incentive compatibility for users, which is the broad result is that we have these sort of two states. There's the state when there's not so low a bid that demand outstrips the block size, and then it's the posted price period, when you're just paying the base fee plus a smidgen, and then there's the period when it reverts to the first price auction. And if users knew which one they were in, they would know what to do. I mean, they would know what to do in the posted price period, and they would know they're in the bad situation they're always in today, when they're not in the posted price period. But unfortunately, from the perspective of a user with a very high value transaction, the situation that they face is the next block could be one of those, and they don't know it. So what if you don't have one of these sort of high value time sensitive transactions? It's not really a big deal. You presume you're in the posted price mode, and if you skip a block, then you notice that, oh, this is a period of demand. Is it worth it to me to play in this kind of difficult auction? But if you do have some arbitrage to run, it's going to happen in this next block or not at all. Then you have sort of a tricky situation where I don't think you can model what you're facing either as the posted price or the first price auction mechanism, where you need some kind of probabilistic synthesis or something to come up with the optimal strategy. And I wondered if you had comments on that.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I mean, and it sort of connects to something I did think a lot about while doing the report, although I write almost nothing about it, which is like priority gas auctions and sort of front running bots and this kind of stuff. So even in a period, right? Because and again, this is something I would need to see more data about to do the modeling, but I could imagine one type of transaction where it's really important to get to the next block, but that doesn't matter where in the block it is. But my understanding is sort of there's a lot of transactions where not only do they want to be in the next block, they want to be in a very specific position in that block, like first or last or something like this. And so I don't have a good sense of, of the impatient transactions, what fraction of them also care about the block position. Because I will say, if most of the impatient ones were also transactions that were sort of trying to get the first slot, if there's 2 or 3 of those, they're going to be competing with each other anyways, right? So literally, if there's nothing in the mempool other than 3 different bots both trying to pick up the same arbitrage opportunity, right, they're all going to be setting kind of high tips anyways, right? Because they're just competing with each other. Forget about everybody else, right? And so if that's the dominant paradigm for the really impatient transactions, that they actually need to not just get in the block, but actually outcompete other people who are also going to wind up being in the block to get a position, then I think the problem is less, that you're talking about is less serious, because basically, sort of a small number of transactions that are just sort of blasting away on the tips, that doesn't really mess things up for everybody else. If you have 12.5 million gas worth of transactions doing it, then you start having problems. But if there's just kind of say, 2 million gas of transactions that are just being super high, I don't care. From my perspective, it's still, I don't have to compete with them. So this is an example where, again, the modeling, you get a different answer depending on the assumption you made about the mix of transaction preferences. And that's, again, the kind of thing, I think it can be valuable as an exercise to write down plausible models and see what happens as you vary the model. But I would be more comfortable having it be a little more grounded in the data to do that. So one way of thinking about the report, like the most rigorous sections of the report kind of correspond naturally to the parts of the problem where I didn't need to understand much about the actual data, where the conclusions were more or less independent of, say, like what mempools look like. But I love the question in general, and just so I guess going back to Vitalik's question about micro issues, microeconomic issues. I mean, that's another great mechanism design question, which is if you have users with richer preferences than just you're in the block or not, like you have preferences over what happens in the block you're included in, is there a sort of scalable way to allow those users to express those preferences beyond just using this one bidding parameter to try to communicate that they want it a lot. So all of that circle of ideas, I find very interesting. So I think it's a great direction.
It's really challenging to try to think about the structure inside of a block.
Yeah.
Even at the level of I really want to be in the next block. This mechanism, because I mean it's fundamentally an improvement. It's still, you can always imagine you're in a first price auction and do what you're doing now. So it's still an improvement, but this mechanism does introduce sort of a new layer of uncertainty, a new sort of decision you have to make, and whether you would make it probabilistically or not.
Right. But it's true. I feel like talking this through with you and Vitalik. I mean, I do sort of see using the weighting cost model. I now do think you could probably do a quite interesting study investigating kind of medium-sized cartels, and sort of in the game theory there. Again, I haven't done that, but talking it through with the two of you, I can start to imagine what that would look like, which would be really interesting.
Well, thank you so much for a great paper and a great talk.
Oh, thanks.
So Vitalik and Tim, if you guys are willing, could we briefly look? Earlier we talked about this Q&A feature, and it's possible. I think we got a couple more in there. So if you guys are willing, just to look in there and see if there's any interesting questions that you're willing to answer.
Yeah, let me. The last question I'm seeing is, what impossibility results were overcome by cryptography? So there's a conference called EC, Economics and Computation. That's kind of the big algorithmic game theory conference. And so Matthias Ferreira, who's a PhD student at Princeton, and Matt Weinberg, who is his advisor. So they basically showed how, so the economists basically said to get something which can't be spoofed by the mechanism designer, you have to do an English auction, which takes lots of rounds. And so what Matthias and Matt proved is that actually if you have cryptography, you can get the same game theoretic guarantees, but under 2 rounds. Obviously assuming kind of, you can't break cryptography and that kind of thing. So that's a paper called Credible, Truthful, and 2-Round Optimal Auctions via Cryptographic Commitments. Okay, let's see. Oh yeah, Hasib asked an interesting question. In addition to lowering transaction fee variance, will 1559 lower the aggregate fees paid by users relative to first price auctions? That's a good question. So it depends a little bit on whether you're asking the question in theory or whether you're asking the question in practice. Theory, I'm actually less sure. In practice, I would expect so. Just because there's really 2 things, there's really 2 separate effects that are happening. One is what's going on with the market clearing price, which again would be like if you magically knew the exact right base fee. So what we saw is that 1559 keeps the base fee kind of like smoother, less spiky. We didn't really say anything about its average value. But then the second thing you can ask is, are users paying the market clearing price, or are they paying actually sort of inadvertently much more than that? And based on my understanding about how lots of wallets do sort of fee estimation, and even if you just sort of like look at Etherscan and stuff, it seems that plenty of people are paying more than the market clearing price for no good reason. And that dimension you would expect to be made better by 1559. right? So I don't know if the market clearing price itself is going to be any better on average. If so, not by much, I don't think. But you would expect actual fees paid under 1559 to much more closely hew to the market clearing price than they do currently, where you do see people sort of overpaying due to poor tools. All right, let's see. All right, so can miners collude to decrease the base fee? Yes, they can. The way you do that is by publishing blocks that are under full. So if all the miners got together and decided, hey, we're only going to publish empty blocks for a while, that would decrease the base fee to 0. The reason this is fragile is because, right, really what you'd like to do is free ride on all the other members of the cartel. Like other people leave money on the table to keep the base fee low, then you swoop in, and you're just going to sort of going to collect all of the transactions for yourself. So what I mean by fragile is that you'd rather actually be outside of the cartel than inside the cartel. So the cartel's behavior may be helping its members, but it's actually helping non-members even more. So that's what fragile means in this context. So if you have something, if there's an incentive to secede, it basically means to prevent people from seceding, you need to have some credible threat of punishment. And I think it's actually an interesting discussion to what extent that exists, say, among miners in Ethereum. I don't know. But to the extent that you can't reliably punish people, it's very hard to prevent them from seceding from your cartel if they do better free riding on your cartel. So Alex asks, does the Vickery auction format still fail if you include a fee burn? Yeah, I mean, I worry, I think with a fee burn, you're definitely going to have the same problem you had with the first price auction in the fee burn, which is you're going to have just users in the miner go off chain to avoid the fee burn. If you literally burn, so it also depends how much you burn. If you burn everything, then no. The miner, nothing on chain that the miner could do could help it because its revenue is 0 either way. If you burn, say, half of the revenues, then I think you're still going to have the same problem with fake transactions. Because again, the miner's getting 50% of whatever the revenue is. So if they can, I see what you're saying. But now the fake transactions get partially burned. I see, that's a good point. So let's put it this way. The fee burn would help discourage the fake transactions, but it wouldn't eliminate all of the possibilities. So there would still exist cases where the miner would be incentivized to do the fee burn, where the payment of the fee burn is outweighed by the extra revenue you get from the rest. All right. So Hasib asks, if base fee revenues were paid forward instead of burned, do you believe miners should be indifferent to 1559 or in favor of it due to lower fee variance? That's a good question. Yeah. As you say, you certainly would expect they wouldn't mind at this point. At worst, it's revenue neutral. And you also raise a good point. So the fee variance kind of depends on how many miners you smooth it out over. But let's assume you smooth it out over a lot. Let's assume that the current base fee revenues you split equally among the next 1,000 miners, which would then mean that the rewards per block would be pretty similar from block to block. That's a good question. In some ways, I've never seen any data that speaks to this either way, but you could definitely imagine miners enjoying the fact that they know basically what the tips would still be sort of variable, but at least sort of knowing what the block reward is would be good. So that's an interesting point. I hadn't thought about that benefit. Have the 3 main alternative directions led to changes in the EIP 1559 spec? Not to this point. My sense is, when I drop in on the 1559 team, I think they really want to get it deployed, and they're nervous about anything that would delay deployment further, which I completely understand. So I would suggest, I think the alternative directions would be great to just debate over while the current 1559 spec proceeds as it's going. Yeah, so not to this point, but I'm definitely curious if there's any serious discussion about wanting to, maybe not in the initial deployment of 1559, but perhaps in some subsequent iteration. looking at the alternative directions. So someone says, given that you've thought about 1559 a lot, how do you think the base fee update rule should change? Yeah, I mean, so in the report, what I try to do is kind of separate different orthogonal dimensions along which you could explore. To be honest, this is again something which is hard to do theory about without data. You know, without knowing exactly kind of what's going to be the distribution of transaction values over time. If I had to pick one thing, the current proposal does a sort of linear interpolation. So basically, if someone publishes a double full block, the base fee goes up by 12.5%. If they publish an empty block, it goes down by 12.5%. Incidentally, this 12.5 has nothing to do with the 12.5 million gas that are in a block. It's just random that those two numbers are the same. So you get plus minus 12.5% change in the base fee at the extremes, and then you linearly interpolate in between. And it's not obvious to me that you want a linear, I mean, there's a lot of things that are not obvious, but I might start by playing with that linear interpolation. And for example, not changing things as much if you're close to the 12.5 target. So at the extremes, you could still go sort of by a lot because it seems that you're way out, you know, but if your block is sort of ballpark, you know, in the 10 to 15 million gas range, maybe don't change it as quickly. For example, that's one thing I would imagine experimenting with. But again, hard to, you know, I really think probably, I think what we want to do now is sort of brainstorm update rules that seem worth experimenting with, and then actually experiment with them. I don't really think theory is going to be able to say, theory will say some stuff, but theory is unlikely to kind of tell you this is the optimal update rule to use. That's a little much to ask. It's going to depend too much on the details of the transaction distribution.
There's probably enough to go for a very long time.
Maybe say 5 to 10 more minutes or something, or what do you
Sure,
think?
great. Vitalik, are any of these questions that you want to comment on or to contribute?
Let's see, just looking through the list here. You know, in terms of like the one about will it actually decrease average fees that people pay, like, I mean, at the beginning, I had definitely hoped it would, but I think realistically, it probably won't change by much. And the reason basically is like you have to kind of look at short-term and long-term changes in isolation, right? Because there's this effect where like in the short term, you know, you have some equilibrium fee and some people pay 3 times higher, some people pay 10 times higher or 100 times higher because they either like really care about their transaction getting included quickly or they have bad algorithms or something like that. But the thing to kind of keep in mind is that like those actors are, and they're either impatient or they're not kind of short-term rational, but they may be like more long-term rational. So what I mean is that, you know, if you have any in this environment where, you know, the blocks get basically like roughly filled up, where, you know, the people at the bottom are paying 30 gwei, and then there's people paying like say 50 to 300 gwei. Then if you take those 50 and 300 gwei people and you make it possible for them to go down to 30, then there's going to be a lot more, like there are going to be more people that come in, right? Like there's going to be more people that are willing to participate now that it's possible for them to pay only 30 gwei without and simultaneously get the benefits of either being included quickly or not have to worry about being super clever with pricing. And so the equilibrium gas price would go up. Instead of you know, some people paying 30, other people paying 50 to 300, it might be more like everyone paying 40 or everyone paying 50. And so the gain isn't so much decreasing fees for everyone as it is just increasing fairness and like decreasing the extra costs that you need to pay in order to either wait less or just be less clever about how you do fee estimation. So that's one thing. Another one is so in the chat section there are a couple of people shilling EOS, and you know, that's actually interesting because like a lot of people don't know about this, but EOS has this interesting kind of non-standard fee model where instead of paying a transaction fee, if you are holding EOS coins, you get assigned a certain maximum transaction count that's proportional to your EOS balance. And basically, you have the ability to send that many transactions for free. And I wrote a post on ETH Research a couple of years ago where I was critical of this model. I see that it does seem like it would give you some of 1559's benefits, and it has this kind of prefer variability in block sizes over variability in transaction fees kind of property to it. But my criticism of that model was basically that eventually people are going to want to send lots of transactions, and there's going to be competition for who gets to send those transactions. And there are people who have a lot of EOS coins and who don't want to send many transactions. There's going to be people who have few EOS coins and they want to send many transactions. And so the thing that I predicted is that eventually you're just going to see a secondary market emerge where people just end up kind of lending their EOS out to other people. And you'll get something that's fairly equivalent to a present day fee market, except with a lot of extra steps in between. So that was my comment on what was in EOS then. And I admit I haven't been following EOS closely since then, and have they changed their fee market, or how kind of real world circumstances actually ended up playing out? But would definitely be interesting to check out again.
What I propose is that I give a few thank you comments right now. And then if everyone wants, and we'll just keep the Zoom event up, and we'll, if all of our panelists want to remain, they're welcome to, or otherwise they're welcome to end. We'll certainly keep the event up. If it gets small enough number of attendees, we'll just promote them all to allow them all to talk. So, thank you. Professor Tim Roughgarden for the report and for your presentation. Vitalik, thank you for proposing EIP 1559. Thank you for participating in the event today. I'm grateful to our Decentralization Foundation guys. I enjoy this community a lot. Let me know if we can help make it enjoyable for you as well. So thank you very much. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Vitalik. Thank all of you.